Bonjour et bienvenue à tous. I'm Mary Ellen Connellan, the Executive Director of the Alliance Française de Chicago, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to our much anticipated new series, The Great Churches of Paris, the evolution of the church and ecclesiastical architecture in Paris from the Middle Ages to today, with the incomparable Russell Kelley. Following the success of Les Grands Châteaux de la Loire et Ile-de-France and the making of the French Garden series of online talks, Russell Kelley spent the summer visiting the most beautiful churches in Paris. And our curator, extraordinaire, returns to offer a series of 6 talks replete with information about another important pillar of French cultural and architectural heritage, the extraordinary variety of churches that were built in every commune in France, but especially in Paris over the past 1,000 years. We hope to see you every Thursday at noon Central Time in Chicago, at 1 p.m. Eastern Time in Miami, and at 19h Central European Time in Paris from January 12th through February 16th, 2023. So today, Russell jumps right in and starts with the Romanesque churches of the High Middle Ages, with a shining example being Saint-Germain-des-Prés in the 6e arrondissement, the 6th arrondissement. As luck would have it, I attended the wedding of a dear friend there early this fall and experienced the magic and beauty of its majesty firsthand. Breathtaking. But before we get started, I have just a couple of other announcements. One is that we're terribly proud of our Entrée Libre initiative to offer quality programming to students of French language and culture in universities to attend the program free of charge. It is thanks to people like yourselves that we're able to offer this. Great Churches of Paris and many other programs. Supporting us is easy. Become a member, make a donation. Every little bit counts for not-for-profit organizations like ours. Now, this series would also not have been possible without our friends and partners at the Alliance Française de Miami Métro, merci beaucoup, and the support of our communication partners, the Fédération of Alliance Française USA, the French Heritage Society, the Association of American Women in Europe, and the Fondation La Sauvegarde de l'Art Français. Finally, a few words about Russell Kelley. Russell Kelley is the curator and moderator of the past 2 winters Zoom lecture series on the Grands Châteaux of the Loire and Ile-de-France and the making of the French Garden. He's lived in Paris for over 30 years and is the author of The Making of Paris, the story of how Paris evolved from a fishing village into the world's most beautiful city. What more is there to say? À vous, Russell.
Thank you very much, Mary Ellen, for that introduction. I'm delighted to be back for another session here on an important cultural pillar in French heritage, the churches of Paris and France. Before we start, I would just like to draw people's attention to the fact that at the bottom of their screen there, right next to the Q&A icon, is a CC icon, which means closed caption. And if you click on it, you will get a closed caption of everything that I'm saying. If you have any difficulty hearing, you can read it. The objective that I have in this series is to give all of us the vocabulary with which to understand the various churches and the styles of architecture of the churches in Paris, number one. And number two, to put all of these magnificent churches into their proper historical context. So I will be talking both about churches and also about the church, the Catholic Church, the Catholic Church of the Western Roman Empire in this series. So the evolution of the church and ecclesiastical architecture, the churches in Paris from the Middle Ages to today. It'll cover 1,000 years in some detail, but before I want to set the stage for you. So there are a lot of churches in Paris. Depending on what website you look at, you see numbers that range between 130 and 200 out of a total of 45,000 in France, a full 37 of which are named Notre Dame, which means, of course, Our Lady. If you look at the breakdown of religions in France, which pretty much applies to Paris as well, France is roughly 2/3 Christian, mainly Catholic, Roman Catholic, only 2% Protestant, which I've added up in there, Muslim, roughly 8%, Jewish, roughly 1%. And more and more people are declaring no particular religion, interestingly. The Catholic Church is very present in Paris. It's surprisingly present. 106 parishes, each one with its church, plus additional separate parishes for the Spanish, Polish, and Portuguese churches, and another 10 for the Eastern Orthodox parishes. There are religious orders all over the city of Paris, mainly in the 5th arrondissement, the Latin Quarter, but also just in every arrondissement, small, oftentimes, some large as well. 80 different male religious orders, 140 female religious orders. Sometimes they have very few people. And of course, Catholic schools, the Jesuits and the other orders continue to be very important in the education system in France. The very new Archbishop of Paris, Laurent Ulrich, was appointed only last May. So in this series, we're going to go through these 6 or 5 phases, shall we say, of the evolution of church architecture. Romanesque churches today, next week Gothic churches, followed by Renaissance, then Baroque churches, neoclassical churches, and finally, in the 19th century, we find the important restoration movement to preserve particularly the Gothic churches, like Notre Dame, but also there was another surge of church building with so-called eclectic churches, which cannot be categorized as any individual design style. And we'll close with a session dedicated entirely to Notre Dame de Paris. It will talk not only about the construction of this magnificent cathedral, but also, sadly, the fire of April 15th, 2019. And we will be joined by Michel Picot, who is the head of the Les Amis de Notre Dame, and who will talk to us with great authority about the plans to restore Notre Dame de Paris. But first, we start with the Romanesque churches of the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages. What are the High Middle Ages? Well, the Middle Ages are now broken down into 3 sections. The Early Middle Ages, formerly known as the Dark Ages, that essentially started with the fall of the Roman Empire. But in the case of Paris, we could be more France, we could be more specific and say it starts with the fall of the Romans in Gaul, which was at the Battle of Soissons in 486. And it was characterized by fragmentation of the empire, then consolidation under Charlemagne, and then fragmentation again. The High Middle Ages, which we're going to be talking about later on this morning, between 1000 and 1300, which again, if you're talking only about France, really started in 987 with the founding of the Capetian dynasty. And this was a period of relative stability. The Viking invasions were over, population grew, and church building surged. And then there are the Late Middle Ages, which go from 1300 to 1500. To be more precise again, in France, it ended in 1515, which is when François Ier started the Italian Wars and brought back with him the Renaissance. And the Late Middle Ages were characterized by crises such as the terrible Black Death, which probably reduced the population of France and most European countries by a good quarter, and the 100 Years' War. So Before we get into the Middle Ages, though, I'm going to do a quick run through the first 1,000 years so you understand basically how Christianity started in France and churches started in France. It all started on the Ile de la Cité, which of course wasn't called the Ile de la Cité when it was first founded by a tribe of Celts called the Parisii in the 3rd century BC in the middle of the Seine River. They were the fishermen. So in my book, when I refer to the fishing village, it's the fishing village of the Parisii. And Julius Caesar invaded Paris in 52 BC. A little earlier than that, 55 BC, I believe, 58 BC it was, BC, and then finally defeated the Gauls at the Battle of Vercingetorix in 52 BC. And another general of his, Labienus, defeated the Parisii and established a new Roman city on the left bank, the left bank of the Seine, which you see today. It's a hill now known as Montagne Sainte-Geneviève. At that time, it was called Lucotice, something like that. The city was known as Lutece or Lutetia, the Roman city, and you can see the forum at the peak where the Pantheon now is located. Saint-Denis arrived in Paris roughly 250 AD. He's considered to be the first bishop of Paris, and Paris as a bishopric, a diocese, fell under the responsibility of the Archdiocese of Sens and remained that way for 1400 years, surprisingly enough. Saint-Denis was beheaded along with some of his cohort on the island of the mountain of martyrs, now called Montmartre, and a shrine was built in his honor in 313. He later became the patron saint of France. Why was the shrine built in 313? Well, that's because everything changed in the Roman Empire with respect to Christianity in 313 with the Edict of Milan, which all of a sudden granted religious toleration to Christians. It was followed by the Edict of Thessalonica in 380, which made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And you can see that the spread of Christianity throughout the Roman Empire started in 325, basically, with the First Council of Nicaea, from which the Nicene Creed comes. Constantine, who was responsible for the Christianization of the Roman Empire, built the first Basilica of St. Peter in Rome in 326, and it was not modeled on the Roman temples, which with their pillars and so on, which were only really occupied by the priests. They had to come up with a structure that was where the congregation could congregate. And the model that was chosen was the model of the Roman civic building known as a basilica. And this, you can see it in this image here. It's a great image because it shows you it's got a central nave and side aisles, much like the classic cathedrals and churches that we know today. It started from the very beginning. You will see, however, that in both cases, particularly the nave has a wooden roof, which that changed, as we'll see later as well. And this structure became the standard form for Christian churches. So it started in 325. The Roman Empire was the victim of successive invasions over the years. And you'll see at the top there, the Franks were the ones that finally came in. But before the Franks came in to the Roman Empire to Gaul, the Gallo-Roman area, and defeated the Romans. The Huns, Attila the Hun, invaded France, and he tried to invade Paris, but he was resisted by the people at the insistence of Geneviève, a nun, Geneviève. And son of a gun, if Attila the Hun didn't avoid Paris after all, and she was sainted, and became Saint Geneviève, and she was the one who enlarged that first early Basilica of Saint-Denis and became the patron saint of Paris. And her sculpture appears on this pillar on the left bank side of the Pont du Pont du Tourelle, Pont de la Tourelle. Clovis was the Frank who defeated the Romans at the Battle of Soissons in 486, founding the Merovingian dynasty that was to rule France for the next 250 years. Sorry, roughly 300 years, shall we say. And he made Paris his capital. He vowed that if he won this battle against another German tribe called the Alemanni, he would convert to Christianity, which was the religion of his wife Clotilde. He won and he converted and Reims to Christianity, making Christianity the official religion of France, one of the very first countries to do so after the collapse of the Roman Empire, as you can imagine, which only was 10 years earlier, earning France the sobriquet, the fille aînée de l'Église, the eldest daughter of the church. And Clovis founded on the Montagne Sainte-Geneviève a church that later developed into the Abbey Sainte-Geneviève at the top of the Montagne Sainte-Geneviève, called Lucotitius at the time. It was, like everything else before 1000, destroyed basically by the Viking invasions in the 9th century, and was rebuilt more than once. The image on the left is from the 11th century, and the arrow is pointing to the Tour Clovis, which is all that remains of the 11th century abbey, and it stands today inside the walls of the Lycée Henri IV, behind the Pantheon. If you're standing at the top of the South Tower of Notre Dame, which you can't do anymore, hopefully you'll be able to do that in 18 months. Not sure about that. And you look south, this is what you see. The Pantheon to the right, sticking up high, and the arrow is pointing to the Tour Clovis, right behind the Église Saint-Étienne-du-Mont, which we'll be talking about next week. The tomb of Sainte-Geneviève is in that very church, Saint-Étienne-du-Mont, but not the body. The body, unfortunately, was removed and burned during the Revolution, and the ashes scattered in the Seine. Childebert was the son of Clovis and Clotilde, and he was responsible for building the first, after the Abbé Sainte-Geneviève, the next 3 churches in Paris, all of which exist in one way or another today. Not the original church, but at least the site. And this is one of the themes that will come up time and time again, is the incredible building and rebuilding and renovation of churches over the centuries. The first thing he built was the Basilique de Saint-Étienne, St. Stephen's Basilica, which was actually built right in front of today's Notre Dame. On the Ile de la Cité. You can't see it now because it's behind the construction walls, but hopefully soon you'll be able to make out the small square paving stones embedded in the parvis, the square Notre Dame, which outline the walls and the aisles of St. Stephen's Basilica. And there's also at the bottom, the arrow is pointing to another sign that says the porch of St. Stephen's Basilica. That's where it was located. If you're looking from the North Tower out across the parvis of Notre Dame, those stones are at the very bottom where that arrow is pointing to. You can't actually see the stones, but they're directly in front of the west facade of Notre Dame. Another church built by Clotilde, the first version of the Église Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois. Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois is to be distinguished from the Saint-Germain-des-Prés, 2 different Germain This is the one from the city of Auxerre. So the first church was built in 542, but the current church that you see really dates more from the 15th century. And then his third church was the Église de Saint-Vincent, which also was destroyed, the original church, rebuilt, and what you're seeing to the left is the tower, is the only thing that survived, and not all of that, from the church of the 11th and 12th century, when it was rebuilt and rededicated to Saint-Germain, and it is now known as the Église de Saint-Germain-des-Prés. This is an image of a church in Metz in eastern France, and I include it here because it is a 7th century Merovingian church. So this is what the churches look like back in the first early Middle Ages. Not that different from the basilique first built for St. Paul's by Constantine. This map shows you the cluster of green churches built on the island, the Ile de la Cité. At one time, it had over 20 different churches on it and chapels, amazingly enough. Now there are only two, Notre Dame and Sainte-Chapelle. And that, of course, was the center of Paris, which is why there's a cluster of green churches during the Middle Ages. The green churches were all built in the Middle Ages. And then the pink churches started to be built as Paris spread out further and further. Dagobert, great-grandson of Clovis, founded the Abbey de Saint-Denis. It was the beginning, so an abbey in a monastery. It was no longer just a pilgrimage site, it was an official abbey. And another generation or two later, Pepin le Bref, Pepin the Short, the founder of the Carolingian dynasty, called the Carolingian dynasty because so many of the kings in the dynasty were named Charles or Carolus in Latin. He started the new Saint-Denis Church, which was finished by his son, Charlemagne, who became Holy Roman Emperor in 800. He established his capital in Aachen, also known as Aix-la-Chapelle, in today's Germany, and is considered the father of Europe. But he did two things. First of all, he moved the capital from Paris, his capital from Paris to Aachen, which diminished Paris, the importance of Paris as a city. And very significantly, although he was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by the Pope, Charlemagne still was responsible largely for the church because he retained the power to appoint the bishops in his empire, and his empire was vast. This is the beginning of something that is recurrent through the next 1500 years, Gallicanism versus Ultramontanism. I'll just mention it once, but Gallicanism is the belief that the papal primacy was limited. It wasn't supreme, it was limited by the temporal power of monarchs, in this case, Charlemagne, but also the ecumenical councils of cardinals, by bishops, and customs of particular churches. And it gets its name from Gallia, which is the Latin name of Gaul. Ultramontanism was the opposing view, where the authority of the Pope extended across the Alps, across the mountains, to all kings. And it's been a tug of war ever since the Middle Ages between the church and the kings as to who is the most powerful. You can see that the Carolingian Empire was greatly expanded by Charlemagne. Blue was what he inherited from Pepin. The red he conquered, and the yellow were tributary states. And in the red bit You will see at the bottom kind of a separate brighter red. Those are the papal states. So while the papal, because the Pope not only was an ecclesiastical leader, he was a secular leader because he had his own territory, but those territories fell within the purview of the Carolingian Empire. There's Aachen, there's the Frankish, soon to become the Holy Roman Empire. Charlemagne only visited Paris once to dedicate the Église Saint-Denis. When he died, it was the beginning of the fragmentation of his empire. He had his son inherited everything from him, but his grandchildren, his son had 3 children who split the empire between them. Paris or France ended up being the westernmost bit under the jurisdiction of Charles le Chauve, Charles the Bald. The Vikings, believe it or not, worked their way all the way up the Seine to attack Paris 4 times in the 9th century, laying waste to everything they could get their hands on. The Roman wall that had been built to protect against the barbarians in the 3rd century or 4th century was rebuilt, but everything out around the Ile de la Cité, but everything on land on either side was laid waste, including the monasteries. They came all the way up the river on their longboats until finally, in the Treaty of Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, the King of France gave them land in order to essentially, in exchange, you will no longer continue to be bandits and invade France. And the Vikings took the deal. They were known as, in addition to known as Normans, as Vikings, they were known as Northmen, Normans, Norsemen, and Normans, which is where the name Normandy comes from. Now we finally get to modern France, and this is what we're going to be talking about in this series. And we're going to go through the various dynasties right up to today. Today we're going to be talking about the Capetian dynasty, but there were others. And the Roman and the architectural styles also evolved over that same period of time. And we'll be talking about the Romanesque style today. Some vocabulary: cathedral, that's where the bishop has his seat, which is the name of a seat in Latin is cathedra. The basilica, same floor plan as the Roman civic basilica. And the Pope gives the title, it's an honorary title, to important churches that aren't cathedrals. There are parish churches. Every parish has its own church, often in the case of Paris, built by local guilds, like the Saint-Jacques de la Boucherie. Boucherie means butchery, so the butcher guild built Saint-Jacques de la Boucherie. And then there are the abbey churches that are attached to monasteries. I didn't include in this list chapels, which can be part of a palace, for example, and they don't have a dedicated priest. Hugh Capet was the first French king, not Frankish, and he was based in Paris once again, and it was the beginning of modern France. His domain, however, was small. It's just a little bit in blue there, believe it or not, and the rest of these duchies and counties were his vassals, who were more or less independent. So while the royal domain was small, the influence of the church was large. It's true that the royal domain expanded significantly, particularly under Philippe II, Philippe Auguste, who in his wars with the Angevin Empire conquered once again, or Normandy, as well as Brittany and Aquitaine, substantially expanding the reach of the royal domains, but still the church remained dominant. And during that period, the Gregorian reforms asserted papal supremacy, which were demonstrated in the fact that the Pope essentially ordered the kings of Europe to fight the Crusades, and they did so, permitting Christianity to expand vastly throughout Europe, and in particular, monasteries to spread throughout Europe in that period, basically between 1100 and 1300. Which brings us to the Romanesque style. That's the topic of this talk. It means descended from the Roman. So the Romanesque style originally replicates really what the Romans were building. Thick walls, small windows, rounded arches, barrel vaults, exterior buttresses, and simple decoration. The Romanesque style really came to its peak during the age of monasteries. And the age of monasteries, so there's so many monasteries. I tried to make some sense of them all since the names come up time and again. The first monastic order were the Benedictines, known as the Black Monks because they wore black robes, founded in Italy in 529, and they were very austere, hardworking types. Each abbey in this loosely knit order was independent, self-supporting, governed by abbots elected for life. This is the ideal monastic plan for an abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland, which was never built. Nevertheless, it was the model for future abbeys. The two oldest monasteries in or near Paris and the biggest landowners were Benedictine abbeys, namely Saint-Germain-des-Prés and Saint-Denis. Saint-Geneviève, while it was established as a church in 506, it didn't become a monastery until 811, and it was in the Victorine order. Surge of monastic orders in the Middle Ages. I'm only going to mention three of these many different orders. The Benedictines that we've just talked about, they fell into decadence. Their dominant period was the 9th, 10th century. They were replaced by the Cluniacs, a spin-off basically of the Benedictines, who had their peak in the 12th century. And they in turn became decadent and were replaced by reforming Cistercians in the 11th and 12th century. So why was there this surge in monastic spreading out across Europe? Well, the Gregorian reforms resolved what was known as the investiture controversy. As I mentioned, Charlemagne, he appointed his bishops in his empire. Well, there was some dispute whether the Pope should be appointing the bishops or not. Being a bishop was important because not only did you were you nominally in charge of a diocese, but it was in commendam, which is to say you had the revenues, right to the revenues of the diocese. So instead of appointing lay people, Pope Gregory asserted his right to appoint clerics in commendam, but not for a king to appoint lay bishops. Also, the Gregorian reforms finally forbade the practice of simony, which is the sale of offices. And then later on in the Lateran Council, celibacy was made mandatory amongst priests. And one of the reasons why they did that was because priests would marry, they would give their property away, and the Lateran Council deemed it better for the property and the priest to stay in the church, the property of the priest to stay in the church. And then there was the monastic reforms of the Cluniacs that I mentioned, all of which made
from Palm Beach.
So the Benedictine, the Cluniac congregation, as I said, was a new version of the Benedictine order that was founded at Cluny in 911, reforming the Benedictine order. Unlike the loosely held Benedictine system, the Cluniac system was extremely centralized, and all of the annexes which were not called abbeys, they were particularly called priories, were under direct control of Cluny. and it spread like wildfire. As you can see, nearly 1,500 monasteries by the early 12th century. They were succeeded essentially by the white monks, the Cistercians, because the Cluniacs became decadent. They became very wealthy, and they spent less time doing work and prayer like the Benedictines were supposed to do. The Benedictine law, ora and labora, so the Cistercians wanted to get back to the original Benedictine law, and they did so with a number of new abbeys with famous names like Clairvaux, Fontenay, and Citeaux, which gets its name from the Citeaux is where the order gets its name from. The Latin name for Citeaux, for the city of Citeaux, the outside Dijon, is Cistercium. The Crusades fought at the direction of the Pope. Philippe Auguste of France, having consolidated his power in France, went to fight in the Third Crusade, but before he went, he had a wall built around his city to protect against raiding Englishmen in particular. There was a huge surge of population between the time he built his wall in 1200 and 1300. The population in Paris went from 110,000 people to 228,000 people, making Paris the largest city in the largest country in Europe. You can see how much smaller London and England were at that time. They caught up, but it took 500 years. In Paris, there were 8 parishes in 1100 and 32 parishes in 1300. You'll see the names of the parishes here are familiar names of churches today. The paroisse Saint-Paul, Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois, Saint-Eustache, Saint-Marie. And on the left bank, similarly, the parishes, you will recognize the names of the parish churches: Saint-Séverin, Saint-Geneviève-du-Mont, Saint-Benoît. So here's a map of Paris in 1300 with the Philippe Auguste wall. And you can see in red that marks all of the convents and monasteries and priories, both inside and outside the city wall. Charles V built another wall in 1380, and this just gives you another representation of the number of monasteries and convents in the city at that time. So just to mention some of the monasteries, there were intramuros on the right bank. We've talked about Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois. And then there are these other 2 that were built in the 13th century. But most of them were built on the left bank, intramuros. And why is that? It's because the University of Paris was established by Philippe Auguste, the very same Philippe Auguste, one of the most important kings of France, in 1204. It originally started at Notre Dame, and it moved to the left bank. And all of the University of Paris and all of the colleges that made up of it were under the jurisdiction of the Catholic Church. And so that's why all the monasteries were there and why they wanted to be there. They were governed by ecclesiastical law, not by the king, but by the Pope. And instruction, of course, was famously in Latin, hence the name Latin Quarter. By the end of the Middle Ages, there were 88 monasteries in Paris, a much smaller Paris than we have today. And they all had abbey churches, and they were all built in the Romanesque style. So this is what the Romanesque church design looks like. It has a few things that we don't have anymore, and I'm going to highlight what you see with the arrows first. The narthex, which is kind of an introductory area, and I'll show you a picture of one later, no longer really exists. The transverse arch, I'll show you as well. These are arches that go across the nave, perpendicular to the nave. Buttresses, before flying buttresses, there were buttresses. And on the right, you see an arrow pointing east. And that is a French word, actually, orientation, because all churches, basically, up until the Counter-Reformation pointed east to Jerusalem. And that all changed with the Counter-Reformation, but all the churches you will see, the Romanesque churches, all the Gothic churches, they point east. Many architectural developments. Romanesque was not a fixed style. It evolved. It continued to evolve, just like every style evolved. The Gothic style evolved and all. So just to highlight some of the changes in one single century to the Romanesque style of architecture. Stone replaced wood. Remember the earliest churches had wooden roofs. Well, that changed. An early example of that was the wonderful Saint-Philibert in the town of Tournus in Burgundy, which has a fortress like what they call west work, the west facade, and it has an impressive narthex with huge thick walls and pillars. And they're the famous Romanesque rounded arches, both on the aisles and transversally, which is quite unique. And there was a barrel vault, a stone barrel vault, but it wasn't a single vault that went the entire axis of the nave. It was actually transversals, a succession of barrel vaults, quite unique. So that's what a transverse arch looks like. And at Cluny-Trois, the third church built by the Cluniacs in the city of Cluny, which is where the name comes from, or the village of Cluny, also in Burgundy, you have the narthex, etc. And this was kind of the model for Romanesque churches. This is what a drawing of the church looked like. And why do we only have a drawing? Well, because, alas, the church was destroyed, and all that is left is the south transept. And this image is taken from what would have been the front door of the church. So you can see the bottom arrow points to, on the model, where the south transept is, and the upper arrow at the top points to the real south transept, which is all that exists. And you can see how far away it was. It was a huge church, and the south transept is huge. And it too still has the transverse arches that we saw at Saint-Philibert de Tournus. This is an existing, still, Romanesque church in France, the largest one in Toulouse. So this gives you an idea of what Cluny-Trois probably looked like, certainly looked like, with its chevet, which is the easternmost part of the church, surrounded by radiating chapels on the apse and the transepts. A wonderful church that was actually built by William the Conqueror, believe it or not, before he moved over to London. The Abbé de Jumièges, which it was built around a conventual quadrangle, which is to say the convent, which also was a key factor in monastic architecture in the Middle Ages. Another church in Normandy, also built by William the Conqueror before and after his invasion in 1066 of England, the wonderful Benedictine Abbey for Men, with its façade harmonique, very simple decoration on the facade, but two impressive spires and towers above the facade. And the other thing that happened was in that critical century is there an evolution from barrel vaults on the left, which are very Romanesque. And by the later Romanesque period, they're making rib vaults in a transition to Gothic. So extramuros, they're outside the walls of Paris. There were several important monasteries, none of which exist today. What happened to them? Well, here they are, shown on that map of 1300. We'll first talk about Saint-Martin-des-Champs, which is the only one that actually does exist in some form today. And we'll talk next to it is the Enclos du Temple, and we'll talk about that after that. They're in the 3rd arrondissement. So Saint-Martin-des-Champs is called a priory, a priory. Therefore, simply by knowing that, you know it belonged to the Cluniac congregation, and it was started to be built in the 11th century. It still was around in 1550. It still was around in 1739. And it's still around. The west facade, unfortunately, well, was rebuilt in the neo-Gothic style, so it's no longer the original one. But the chevet, with its radiating chapel still exists in the classic Romanesque style. Inside is where Foucault's original pendulum hung for 150 years before it fell and broke. And now there's a model up there. It famously also is hung at the Pantheon, which we'll talk about in a later lecture. And the wonderful nave, which also was reconstructed. So it's very difficult to see something in its original style, something as old a church, as old as this in its original style. But it's in a broken barrel vault. Broken means that it's kind of peaked at the top. It's not totally rounded. There are no side aisles in this church. The wooden ceiling indeed resembles the hull of an upside down ship, which is known as a nave in Latin, which is why we call the central part of the church the nave. The priory is now occupied, or the church, well, the whole priory is now occupied by the Musée des Arts et Métiers, which cannot be translated simply by arts and crafts, because métier is a lot more substantial than that. It means professions. But the museum itself doesn't give an English translation of its title. And that wonderful structure thing hanging from the ceiling there is the aeroplane that Blériot flew across English Channel in 1909, first manned flight, or first flight across the English Channel. And the Saint-Martin, as I said, was a Cluniac priory, and the abbeys from Cluny would come to visit them, keep an eye on things, and they would reside at the Hôtel de Cluny, which was a hotel built by the abbeys of Cluny as their residence. And it now houses, since 1843, the Museum of the Middle Ages, located just at the edge of the Latin Quarter on the Boulevard Saint-Michel and the Boulevard Saint-Germain. I should mention as well, at the same time that the Hôtel de Cluny was built, the Hôtel de Sens was built. And as I mentioned earlier, from the get-go, when Paris first became a diocese, it was under the responsibility of Sens, and it remained that way. So the archbishop until the 17th century, and so the archbishops of Sens, similarly to the Cluniac bishops, abbots, had their hotel as well, which is located in the Marais, and it's the oldest mansion in the Marais. Since 1929, it houses the Bibliothèque Fournie, an art library. The temple enclosure was built around the same time, right next virtually to the Saint-Martin-des-Champs, St. Martin of the Fields, also outside the walls of Philippe Auguste. And it was built by the Knights Templar, les Templiers in French, a military order founded in Jerusalem in 1119. Finally, after the fall of Jerusalem, they built a new, they moved into their new enclosure outside Paris and established it as their primary headquarters until it was disbanded in 312, basically under pressure from the king, Philippe IV, le Bel, the Fair. And Philippe le Bel actually burned at the stake the last grand master of the temple, Jacques de Molay, in 1314, who, while he was going up in flames, cursed Philippe IV and Clement V, the Pope, and their progeny, and son of a gun if both Philip and Clement did not die within a year, and Philip's 3 sons and grandson all died within another 13 years, bringing an end to the Capetian dynasty. So, but the temple continued to stand until 1853. It's now inside the new Charles V wall here, but it was ultimately bought and subdivided. On the left bank, you've got the Abbé Saint-Victor. An arrow points at the right arrow points to the river La Bièvre, means beaver, which is the second river, much smaller little river in Paris that no longer exists. It's been totally covered over. The arrow on the left points to the abbey, which was the original 12th century church, was replaced by a Renaissance church. The abbey was suppressed in 1790. The order was suppressed. The abbey was demolished in 1811 and replaced by the wine warehouse. And the wine warehouse was replaced by the Jussieu campus of the University of Paris in 1951. Further on the left bank is the enormous, famous Abbé de Saint-Germain-des-Prés, which used to own most of the land on the left bank. From 1550, they built a wall around it. Why? Because when Charles V built his wall in 1380, he built it on the right bank only. So he ordered the abbey to build its own wall. Still up in 1615. And it kept on losing land. And the biggest loss of land, of course, occurred in the Revolution, which we'll talk about in a couple of weeks. And it was finally reduced to, this magnificent abbey was reduced to the church that we know today. And that's which we'll talk about in a second. So Charles V wall, built in 1380, it enclosed not only Saint-Martin-des-Champs and Le Temple, but it enclosed another convent called Sainte Catherine. And you will see that next to these convents, they're surrounded by empty land. Well, that empty land is what they called culture. And so what is this word? What does this mean, culture? Well, culture is also known in this map. It's called couture. A coutre is a blade of a plow. So culture is the same as culture, as in agriculture, which means farmland. And Sainte Catherine's farmland was bought and subdivided, and this is what happened all around Paris. This is the fate of all the monasteries in Paris. They were bought at one time or another and subdivided. It is now the main street in the Marais, Rue des Fonds Bourgeois, is built on that Couture Sainte Catherine land, and it now houses some of the most magnificent hôtels particuliers dating from the 16th century, the Hôtel Carnavalet, which is now the Museum of the History of the City of Paris, the Hôtel de la Moignon just across the street, and also next door, the Hôtel de Marle, the Swedish Cultural Center, and the Hôtel de Donon, housing the Musée Cognac-J. So all of the oldest extant churches in Paris were associated with monasteries. We've taken a look at Saint-Germain-des-Prés. We've taken a look at Saint-Martin-des-Champs. The other three, Saint-Germain-des-Prés, it's really only the Romanesque bell tower that qualifies, not the top, because that was added in the 19th century, and not the bottom, because the porch was added in the 17th century, but the bit in between dates from around the year 1000. The choir was actually in the new Gothic style, built around when Notre Dame was built, with an early example of flying buttresses around the chevet. It once upon a time had 2 towers flanking the transept, but both of those were demolished. The interior walls were painted, and they were beautifully restored in the 19th century, and they were restored once again just a few years ago. Hard to believe the churches were as colorful as this one was, but they were. The other one like this is the Sainte-Chapelle. And on Montmartre is the Église de Saint-Pierre de Montmartre. Again, you have to, very difficult to find churches that have the original anything. So this facade, the west facade and the two doors on either side of the central door were both added in the 18th century. It's actually a combination of the Romanesque and early Gothic styles. You can see the view from Sacré-Cœur. The new tower was only built in the 1900s, but in the Romanesque style. This is the plan when it was rebuilt in 1898. It's got a single aisle. Note the transept does not extend beyond the walls. It's got a semicircular apse with radiating chapels, no ambulatory, no passageway between the chancel area, or the sometimes called the choir. In French, it's usually the choir, and the chapel area. So this is classic Romanesque. On the other hand, the nave has an early pointed arch. It's not totally rounded like a barrel arch, and it's got rib vaulting, which is early Gothic, particularly in the choir section at the western end of the church. The ceiling is a ribbed vault. It was confiscated during the Revolution, and a telegraph, a semaphore telegraph tower was installed on top of the apse, requiring the church to be completely restored. Third and final church to talk about in the Romanesque style is the Église Saint-Julien-le-Pauvre, and it's Romanesque chevet. It was originally a Cistercian monastery, and it became a center of learning when the University of Paris moved to the left bank in the early 13th century. It's located in the Square René Viviani, which was built in 1928, and the church is at the top right, not just across the river from Notre Dame. After the original facade collapsed, a new facade was built in the late Renaissance style. And this wall that's to the left of the front door there, it's there because the original church came out to the end of the wall. And when they built the new facade, they just skipped the first two bays and built a new west entrance where it is today. The interior style is Romanesque/Gothic in transition, simple decor, rounded arches, barrel vault, voûte en berceau. Even though the barrel vault was installed later, it's a classic Romanesque vault. I'm not sure if the original ceiling was barrel vault. I haven't been able to nail that down. Round arches, small upper windows in the Romanesque style, but ribbed vaults in the two aisles on either side of the nave. Rib vault croisée d'ogive, side aisle bas côté. Wonderful pictures from the 19th century in pretty rough shape. Church was given to the Eastern Catholic Melkite community who built this wonderful wooden iconostasis, similar to a rood screen, which we'll talk about another time. So in the end, of the very few Romanesque churches in Paris, none of them is intact. If you want to find something that really represents the true classic Romanesque style of church, you have to go into the countryside, and there still are wonderful Romanesque churches in the French countryside, including the Église Saint-Pierre de Brancion not far from Cluny in Burgundy, which is a classic with its chevet with apse and 2 apsidal chapels, clock tower over the transept crossing, and a simple facade without towers. Inside, it does have a barrel vault, but it is a broken barrel vault, which is to say there's a slight peak on it with transverse arches. And frescoes in the apse. Sometime in the old days, they had, earlier even, they had mosaics. It's a wonderful chateau in Brancion as well, from which you can see the chateau in the valley behind. So that's it for Romanesque churches. Next week, we will talk about Gothic churches. And there they are on that wall, on that map from Paris after the Charles V wall. On the left, the Sainte-Chapelle, on the right, Notre Dame. And next week, we will show how we get from this extraordinary Romanesque style of architecture to this extraordinary Gothic style of architecture. So that's it from me on this topic, and I'll take some questions. So, hello, Patricia. You're muted.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I just see you, but that's fine. I do have plenty of questions that arose here. So the first one was that we understood that Saint-Germain-des-Prés was a monastery, and we suppose it was surrounded by pasture. Can you explain why we say Saint-Germain-des-Prés?
Well, there you are. So there are 2 French words for fields. Pré means, of course, field, and so does champ. So all of these monasteries were surrounded by fields once upon a time, some more or less. Certainly the ones that were outside the city wall. Philippe Auguste had expansive fields, and Saint-Germain-des-Prés, Saint-Germain of the Fields, had the most land of all of them. Their property essentially went all the way from what is today the Boulevard Saint-Michel to the Eiffel Tower. Vast properties that they own. And it's been reduced to now a nice church and a tiny little square in front of it. That's development.
Okay, so then the second question was, who was Saint-Germain, the original Saint-Germain? Because we have curious people in the audience that say, you know, there's the famous Comte de Saint-Germain, and there's the Paris Saint-Germain. So who was the original Saint-Germain, the saint?
I don't think he was a football supporter, okay. but so it turns out that, as you may know, there are a lot of saints out there, and there are a lot of them named Saint-Germain, and there are a lot of them named Julien. So the church Saint-Julien-le-Pauvre, there are 10 saints named Julian, for example, and nobody's quite sure which one was the name of the church is after. Saint-Germain-des-Prés, happily, is easy because it was the name of, there is an abbot of the church of the abbey called Germain in the Middle Ages. So it was named after the abbot who was later sainted.
There's actually 2 questions that are related. Is who owns today the Église of Saint-Germain-des-Prés, and therefore who is responsible for the painting, the maintenance, and all this?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'll talk about this in the 5th lecture, but starting in the 19th century, and it was formalized in 1905 by the law of separation of the church and state, all churches in France, there may be some exceptions, are owned by the municipalities in which they are located. All cathedrals in France are owned by the French state. There are 87 cathedrals in France, including Notre Dame. All of them are owned by the French state. So when Notre Dame is being rebuilt, it's the French state, which is why the president of France designated his guy, Georges Alain, General Georges Alain, to oversee it. And it's being redone by the Center of Historic Monuments. It's not the church that's rebuilding Notre Dame. Same thing with Saint-Germain-des-Prés and every other church in the city of Paris owns 85 churches, I believe, in Paris.
And then there was a question. Yes, we heard you say your difference between cathedrals and basilicas, and we wonder why Saint-Germain was not designated a basilica, since it's a very beautiful church. I'm sorry.
I cannot answer that question. I don't know, but to get to a basilica, it's pretty hard. So, for example, Saint-Denis, which trumps Saint-Germain in terms of importance, was a basilica for a good long time, and I believe it was made a cathedral 100 years ago or something like that. And I suppose that it was made a head of a diocese. When it was not a head of a diocese, the highest rank you can get is a basilica.
We have a question. I'm sorry, it's a little bit difficult to navigate because it's between the chat and the Q&A. Yes, we have a question of what happened during the revolution, because we understand that the revolution let the Catholicism down.
Mm-hmm.
Wonder what happened to Saint-Germain-des-Prés.
All right, well, please tune in for the talk about neoclassical churches, and I'll give you a lot of information about what happened in the revolution. But to make it short and sweet, which is why I say the revolution, which changed everything. The revolutionary government of France was anti-Christian, and it closed every monastery, closed every church, confiscated all their property. And there's a long story that goes on from that. When the revolution ended, things got rolled back a bit, but not all the way.
Okay. Listen, I wanted you to know that we had over 100 participants to this lecture, and everybody is congratulating. I don't know. I don't think you can see all the chat and the congratulations, but everybody was extremely interested in this first lecture, and we're hoping for the future. Let me see.
Well, I think next week will also be good fun, because we'll be talking about the Gothic period, which spans more than 300 years, and frankly, the most magnificent cathedrals in France were built in that style.
Okay, so let's take I'll take the last question. I can see that some of those questions are related. How did the Crusades change the churches? And are there some relics of the Crusade in Paris churches? It's a question from Lynn Kelley.
I'm not familiar with any relics related to the Crusades. I think, those tend to be more about saints and of course, famously, and again, I'll talk about this next week, there are some incredibly important relics that originally were bought by Louis IX, and he kept them in the Sainte-Chapelle, his royal chapel. Ultimately, they ended up in Notre Dame, and ultimately they ended up being saved during the fire, which included the crown of thorns, a piece of the cross, and other important relics. I'm not familiar with anything from the Crusades, however. And how did the Crusades change churches? I don't think they changed them much. I mean, because I talked about the period of the Crusades today, and it was the Romanesque style, which carried on. I suspect I haven't studied the churches in the Middle East. I don't know what the churches that were built during the Crusades in the Middle East look like. but I suspect they were more influenced by what was going on in Europe than the other way around.
And well, last question. Who is buried in Saint-Germain-des-Prés? Do we have some famous people buried in the Church of Saint-Germain-des-Prés?
There are, and I can't be precise on that, but there will be Merovingian kings and maybe some probably Merovingian kings. So from between 500 and 750, that stretch. And then they shifted to Saint-Denis sometime thereafter. So the first kind of royal sepulchre was indeed Saint-Germain-des-Prés. Clovis, who kicked things off, was buried. I'm not sure if he was there or at Saint-Étienne-du-Mont. Let's say he was at Saint-Germain-des-Prés. So Merovingian kings.
Okay. Well, Russell, thank you very, very much. I think we went a little bit over the hour, so I think we are looking forward with the questions. We are looking forward the next week, and I don't know if the other panelists are on.
So, well, thank you for handling the questions, Patricia. And I guess I'll sign off and basically thank everyone for attending the first series. Hope that you'll come back next week because the Gothic story is pretty exciting. Actually, every story is exciting, but I love the Gothic in particular. And I want to thank the partners for supporting us and hope that you all will be back next week. So without further ado, merci et au revoir.
Thank you very, very much. This was indeed a lecture extraordinaire. Thank you.